God bless everybody today. In this video, we're going to look at how God equates one day in heaven to 1,000 years on earth. If we look at 2 Peter 3, verse 8, it states this, "But do not ignore this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day." So how do we equate 1,000 years on earth to 1 day of God? In biblical eschatology, a prophetic year or prophetical year is sometimes regarded as being different than an ordinary year, namely, it's a 360-day period of time, or 360 year of time, or a 360-year period of time comprised of 360-day years. So what does that mean to us when we were looking at prophetic events in the Bible and certain passages allude to a certain time that's happening on the earth compared to what's happening in heaven? So I broke this down so you can see how this works out and how I come up with these times in my timelines. So there's, no question on, where these numbers came from and how I believe this is broken down so you can understand it and it makes some sense. So if we take one prophetic year, which would be 360 days on earth, based on a prophetic year, not a Gregorian year, or a 360-day calendar, or even the Jewish calendar, because that sometimes ends up at like 355 days because they have to remove 11 days due to their holidays and different things. In the prophetic year calendar, we use a 360-day time. And so that's important as I go through this, and you'll see why. So if 1 prophetic year is 360 days on earth today, then we have to equate it like this. 360 days on earth times 1,000 years on earth gives us a total of 360,000 days on earth, or equal to 1 day in heaven. But to determine the days, hours, minutes, or seconds on earth, to God's time in heaven, we must work the equation backwards to determine this number. 1 day of God equals 1,000 years of our time on earth. So how does that work? I did it 3 different ways so you can see how this all sort of equates down. So if we take 360,000 days, or total days, based on up here, 360,000 days on earth equals 1 day in heaven, and we divide that by 1,000 years, or 1 day of God, 1,000 years on earth, that equals 360 days on earth. Then you take the 360 days on earth, or the prophetic year, and you divide that by 24 hours, or 1 day of time on earth. This equals 15 days on earth itself, or now. Or you can look at it this way. 360,000 days on earth divided by 24,000 hours. That's 24 hours times 1,000 years equals, again, 15 days on earth. So 15 days on earth equals 1 hour in heaven, or 1 hour to God. And I believe this is extremely important, because if you look at the times that are given to us, especially in the prophetic books, we will realize that he does this for a purpose. So the names apocalyptic year or apocalyptical year have also been used in some literature in obvious reference to Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse of St. John. There is an ongoing debate, but evidence put forward by advocates of of the so-called prophetic year, like myself, can be seen in prophecies of Daniel and Revelation as seen in the use of time, times, and half a time, so that you can equate this to the 160 days, or the 42 months, or the 3.5 years, and this reference then presents a period of 1260 days based on a 360-day Jewish year multiplied by 3.5. If you divide the 1260 days by 42 months, you will get a 30-day month, as 12 months of 30 days equals 360 days a year. And in Scripture, based on all of these Scriptures 10 times, it indicates that we use this type of prophetic year to understand how he's explaining this, and so it does match up with what I've been talking about on my timeline. And so let's go down to a few of the verses that I think this matters, and so you can see where it's sort of being used. And these all come out of Revelation because it's a prophetic book. So if we use Revelation 14:7, King James Version, saying with a loud voice, "Fear God, and give glory to him, for the hour," or 15 days, "of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven, and earth, and the sea, and the fountains of the water." So when we look at these prophetic books, now, sometimes it's based on the Gregorian calendar because it's talking about, we're on the ground at this very moment in latter days, and so we're talking about using the time frame of that specific time, which is now. But if you're looking at prophetic times of when God's hour equals 1,000, or day equals his one day equals 1,000 years on our planet, how does that break down? So let's look at the second example. If Revelation 17:12, "And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings for 1 hour, or 15 days with the beast." So that's what I was talking about on my timeline. I'll also go over this in just a minute. When the armies of Gog are destroyed on the 6th seal, there's about 15 days after that, because he gives these people an hour of power. And so he gives these people 15 days to besiege Jerusalem before he destroys them. And so we need to look at that, and that also then would line up with my calendar and how that works, and I'll go into that calendar in just a second. So the last example is Revelation 8. This would be Revelation 8:1. "And when he had opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for the space of about a half an hour." That's around 7.5 days here. And so think about that. In heaven, even though it's about a half an hour, which is a long pause where nothing is being done in heaven at all. There's just silence, no worshiping, nothing's going on. But in our world, that's about 7.5 days on the ground. And so we need to understand these time frames so you can see how this equates and how we can use this to sort of understand what's coming in the future. So this is the timeline I've shown you many, many times, and this is important to understand why I came up with these days and how they matter to this timeline. But I also want you to realize that when you go down to the bottom of the page, you'll realize that I had already put this down on the bottom so you could sort of equate it. And this is how I came up with this time down here. So you could see the equation, but now I've explained it, so hopefully you can understand it even a little better. But if you go up into the timeline, the half an hour, which is when the seventh seal breaks here, and the 144,000 are selected, that is about 7.5 days period on earth, and it would be about a half an hour in heaven. But when we get to Gog, and he's being released on Israel, and they're besieging it, he gives these people approximately power for an hour. And so that's about 15 days. And so I'm going to blow this up just so you can see a little better. So on the seventh seal, you have a half an hour of silence. And you have the selection of 144,000 here. And when Erdogan, based on my paradigm that I've presented, attacks Israel as the white horseman, because he's unleashed over here, all the seals break on the sixth seal. Right before it breaks, he's besieging Jerusalem. He gives those armies the hour, or power for an hour, or about 15 days. And that's why there's this gap between here and here. And so now you can see why I've given that a 15-day gap, because he gives these armies an hour of power, or 15 days, to attack Israel, and then they're destroyed by the sixth seal. And then they're buried for 7 months, and the weapons are burnt for 7 years, alluding to an upcoming tribulation period. So that's how we can look at that. And then also at the end, we have this hour of God's wrath, which are the 7 bowls. And so that's why I think it's important between the 2nd of October and the 17th of October that there's a 15-day gap, because we're talking about the hour of God's wrath, or the 7 bowls. And so I think it matters. You can judge for you whether this makes sense to you. A lot of people equate these differently, but this is how I equate it, and this is how I present it based on my timelines and things, so you can understand at least where these numbers come from, and also how I'm applying them to the timeline, so that there's no confusion on where the numbers are coming from, and that when he talks about an hour of God's wrath, or about a half an hour of silence, or that he gives these groups, or 10 nations, power for an hour, what does that equate to on Earth's time? And I believe that he tells us that because he shows us these things so we can understand that. God bless everybody. Have a great night and be safe out there. Time is short. Find the only door, the narrow door, and that is Jesus. Without him, we can't get to heaven, and we can't get to the Creator. God bless. Have a great night.